My brothers and sisters, sometimes the greatest strength is found not in the noise we make, but in the silence we keep. You see, silence is not weakness. Silence is not defeat. Silence is often the very stage where God does his best work. Too many of us want to speak, argue, defend, and fight, but there are moments in life when God says, stand still and watch me move. In those moments, you don't need to prove yourself. You don't need to vindicate yourself. You don't need to explain yourself to everybody who misunderstands you. You just need to be silent because God is already working on your behalf. When the Red Sea stood before Israel and Pharaoh's army pressed behind them, there was nothing left to say. The people panicked, but Moses said, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. That same God has not changed. He has the power to part your seas, remove your enemies, and deliver you from what looks impossible. But he's calling you to silence so he can demonstrate his glory without your interference. Sometimes your silence is not a sign of fear. It's a sign of faith. We all like to take control. We want to handle things. We want to respond. We want to show people who we are. But when you trust God, you learn that you don't have to fight every battle. You don't have to answer every critic. You don't have to retaliate to every attack. Your silence is not ignoring the problem. It's handing the problem over to the one who knows how to solve it better than you ever could. Silence says, God, I trust you more than I trust my own words. Think about Jesus. When he stood before Pilate, when false accusations were thrown at him, when they spit on him and mocked him, he could have called down heaven's armies in one command. But he stayed silent because he knew his Father's plan was greater than man's opinion. That silence was not weakness. It was the strength of surrender. If the Savior of the world could stay silent because he trusted his Father, then you and I can be silent, knowing our Father is still on the throne. Silence also protects you. It keeps you from saying words in anger that you cannot take back. It keeps you from stepping outside God's will because you acted on emotion instead of direction. Silence gives space for God's wisdom to settle in your heart before you move. And in that silence, God gives you peace that passes understanding. He whispers, I've got this. Even when storms are raging around you, his whisper in silence is stronger than the loudest thunder in the sky. But let me tell you something. Silence does not mean doing nothing. It means trusting while you obey. It means you pray while you wait. It means you worship while you watch. It means you walk in faith while God works things out in the background. Your silence gives God the platform, but your faith gives him permission to show up and show out. You don't have to announce everything. You don't have to broadcast every move. Sometimes God works best when you step aside, hush your mouth, and let him do what only he can do. So today, if you're carrying a burden, if you're facing enemies, if you're misunderstood, if you're overwhelmed, stop fighting battles that belong to God. Stop trying to defend what God has already promised to protect. Stop filling the silence with fear, doubt, and complaints, and start filling it with trust. Because when you are silent, you create space for God's voice to be heard. When you are silent, you allow his hand to be seen. And when you are silent, you make room for his power to be revealed. Be silent because God is helping you in every situation. You may not see it yet. You may not feel it yet, but he's moving in ways you cannot imagine. Don't confuse silence with absence. His silence is presence. His silence is power. His silence is your proof that the battle is not yours. It belongs to the Lord. So stand still, be silent, and watch God fight for you. When life presses in on you from every side, there comes a moment when silence is not only golden, it's godly. Silence in the face of pressure, criticism, or uncertainty is not a sign that you don't care. It's not a signal that you're defeated. No. Silence can be a declaration of trust in the Almighty, a bold statement that says, God is bigger than this, and I don't need to fight what he has already promised to handle. Too often, when challenges come, our first instinct is to speak, to defend ourselves, to prove our point, or to demand answers. But sometimes the very power of God is unleashed in the moments when you decide not to speak, but to stand still. Because silence is not weakness. It's a weapon of faith. Think about the children of Israel trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. They had nowhere to go. Their words were full of panic. Did you bring us out here to die? They wanted to shout, to complain, to demand answers. But God gave them an instruction through Moses. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. That be still was more than about stopping movement. It was about silence. It was about letting God do what only he could do without the interference of human fear, doubt, or chatter. And sure enough, as they stood still, God parted the waters, proving that his strength shows up most when our mouths are closed and our trust is open. We live in a world where noise is everywhere. Social media tells us to speak our minds. Culture tells us to clap back. Pride tells us to have the last word. But silence in God's presence breaks that cycle. Silence declares that God's voice is louder than the noise of critics, stronger than the accusations of enemies, and more reliable than your own defense. You don't have to keep talking when you know God is working. You don't need to broadcast your side of the story when the author of truth is already writing it for you. Silence is choosing not to let the situation pull you into reaction, but instead push you into trust. Now, don't get it twisted. Silence doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean you fold your hands and stop caring. It doesn't mean you bury your emotions or deny the reality of your situation. Silence means surrender. Silence means you've chosen to hand over the burden to the one who carries it better than you ever could. Silence means you've recognized that no argument, no defense, no long speech can accomplish what God's hand can do in a single moment. Silence means you've exchanged the chaos of your words for the calm of his presence. Even Jesus himself modeled this. When he was dragged before Pilate, falsely accused, spit on, mocked, and beaten, he stayed silent. He didn't argue with his enemies. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't lash out. His silence was not weakness. It was confidence in his Father's plan. That silence was victory. It was the power of knowing that the Father in heaven had everything under control. And because he stayed silent, the cross became the pathway to our salvation. If the Savior of the world could trust his Father enough to stay silent, then surely you and I can trust God when life backs us into corners that look impossible. Silence also protects us. Words spoken in anger, frustration, or fear often leave scars that can't be erased. How many of us have said things we regret, words that cut deeper than we realized, all because we couldn't hold our tongues in the moment? Silence guards us from self-inflicted wounds. It gives us time to listen to God before we respond to people. It gives us space to breathe before we act. Silence is not a lack of action. It's a holy pause where God steadies our spirit before we make a move. That pause can be the difference between regret and peace, between destruction and deliverance. And here's the beautiful thing. While you are silent, God is not. You may not hear him in the thunder. You may not see him in the lightning, but in the quietness of your heart, he whispers, "Be still. I've got this." His Spirit works in silence, nudging you, guiding you, filling you with peace. He moves in the unseen places, orchestrating events, changing hearts, shifting circumstances. Silence gives God room to show himself strong. If you're always talking, always explaining, always defending, you might drown out the very voice you need to hear most. The voice of God saying, "The battle is mine." So many of us lose strength because we wasted on battles that were never ours to fight. We argue with people we don't need to convince. We exhaust ourselves defending positions God has already secured. We try to justify ourselves to those who will never understand us anyway. And all the while, God is waiting for us to hand it over in silence so he can fight for us. Silence is not losing. It's winning God's way. It's choosing to believe that his justice is greater than man's judgment. His power is stronger than human effort, and his timing is perfect even when ours feels delayed. That's why silence in your storms matters. Silence is strength. Silence is surrender. Silence is saying, "God, I trust you to do more in my stillness than I could ever accomplish in my striving." Silence is the stage where God steps into your situation and shows that he alone is God. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to shout it. You just need to be still and let him be who he's always been, the faithful, powerful, never failing God who fights for his children. There are moments in life when silence becomes the clearest demonstration of your faith. We all like to believe we are people of faith, but faith is not only seen in the songs we sing or the prayers we pray. It is revealed in how we respond when we are under pressure. Faith is tested when the situation is louder than your hope, when the voices of doubt rise up all around you, and when your enemies seem to have the last word. That's when silence becomes more than restraint. It becomes a declaration that says, "I trust God enough to let him handle what I cannot." Silence in the hands of a believer is not passive, it's powerful. It is not giving up, it is giving over. It is the spiritual discipline of stepping aside so that God can step in. When Israel stood at the edge of the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's chariots thundering behind them, everything inside of them wanted to panic, to cry out, to complain, to demand answers. They wanted to tell Moses how wrong he was. They wanted to declare defeat before the battle even began. But Moses gave them a word from heaven. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. That stillness was silence born of faith. It wasn't resignation. It was expectation. It wasn't fear. It was trust. God was telling them that their words of panic weren't going to part the sea, but their silence of faith would open the door for His glory to be revealed. And isn't that true for us? We think if we just talk it through, if we defend ourselves enough, if we argue loud enough, we'll fix it. But God is saying, hush, be silent. Let me show you what I can do. Faith-filled silence is more powerful than fear-filled words. When you choose to stop reacting and start trusting, you give God the freedom to fight battles you can't win on your own. This silence of faith shows up when people misunderstand you. You want to prove yourself. You want to set the record straight. But sometimes God says, let me be your defender. This silence shows up when people accuse you falsely. You want to shout, that's not true. But sometimes God says, stay quiet, because I'm the truth that will come to light. Silence shows up when you're surrounded by pressure and chaos. You want to cry out in fear, but God says, don't give fear the microphone. Be silent and let faith do the talking. Even Jesus modeled this for us. When He stood before Pilate and the crowd was screaming, crucify Him, He didn't argue His case. He didn't try to convince anybody of His innocence. He stayed silent because His silence was a louder sermon than any defense He could have spoken. His silence was rooted in the certainty that His Father's plan could not be stopped by human lies or accusations. His silence was proof that He trusted the outcome to the one who was greater than the opposition. That is the kind of faith-filled silence we are called to live in. A silence that doesn't panic in the face of noise, but trusts in the power of God's plan. Now here's the thing about this kind of silence. It's not easy. It takes strength to stay quiet when you're being attacked. It takes courage to keep still when everything in you wants to fight. It takes deep trust to bite your tongue when your name is being dragged through the mud. But that's where faith rises. Faith says, my God is bigger than this, so I don't have to fight to win, because the victory is already His. Silence then becomes an act of warfare. It's not surrendering to the enemy, it's surrendering to the Lord. It's letting Him put on His armor and fight for you. When you are silent in faith, you're not doing nothing. You're doing the most powerful thing you can do. You're standing firm on the promises of God. You're declaring, without words, that you believe He's still in control. Your silence is a weapon that frustrates the enemy because he expects you to fight him on his terms. But when you refuse to engage in his noise, you shift the battle into God's territory. The enemy doesn't know what to do with a believer who won't be baited into fear or anger, but instead chooses silence as an expression of trust. That silence also gives you peace. Instead of exhausting yourself with endless explanations, you rest in the assurance that God knows the whole story. Instead of stressing about outcomes, you trust the one who already knows the ending. Instead of letting your emotions spill out in destructive ways, you sit in the calm of God's presence, confident that He will never leave you nor forsake you. Faith-filled silence is not empty. It's full of expectation. It's the quiet before the breakthrough. It's the stillness that comes before God's mighty hand moves. So the next time you're tempted to argue, defend, or retaliate, remember that silence can be your strongest sermon. Silence says, I'm not worried because my God is faithful. Silence says, I don't need to prove myself because my Father has already approved me. Silence says, I don't have to fight for victory because victory already belongs to the Lord. That silence is not a weakness, it's a witness. It's a testimony that you trust God enough to keep still and let Him fight for you. There is something powerful about realizing you don't have to fight every battle that comes your way. Life will present you with conflict, with criticism, with challenges that seem tailor-made to push you into reaction. The natural instinct is to rise up, to defend, to prove yourself, to retaliate. But when you walk with God, you begin to understand that not every battle has your name on it. Some battles belong to Him. Some conflicts are set-ups for His glory, not arenas for your argument. And silence in those moments is not defeat. It is wisdom. It is you declaring, I don't need to fight this because my God has already promised to handle it. We spend so much energy trying to prove ourselves to people who don't even matter. We want to convince our critics, silence our enemies, and explain ourselves to those determined not to understand us. But why waste breath on those who cannot determine your destiny? Why waste words defending yourself when the only verdict that matters has already been spoken by your Father in heaven? He calls you chosen. He calls you loved. He calls you His child. And when you know who you are in Him, you don't have to keep justifying yourself to them. Silence in those moments is a reminder that your worth comes from above, not from applause or approval here on earth. Think of David when he stood before Goliath. He didn't need to trade insults with the giant. He didn't need to prove himself to the soldiers who doubted him. His confidence was in the Lord, not in his ability to win an argument. He let his actions, guided by faith, speak louder than words. That's the posture of someone who understands the power of silence. You don't waste your voice in battles that don't require it. You don't waste your energy on defending yourself against people who can't stop what God has already started. Instead, you trust the Lord to show up in your obedience and prove Himself through the outcome. Silence also means you don't have to retaliate when others wrong you. People will hurt you. They will misunderstand you. They will talk about you. And your flesh will want to rise up, to strike back, to let them know they cannot treat you that way. But when you belong to God, you understand vengeance is not yours. It belongs to Him. Retaliation only drags you down to the level of those who tried to harm you. Silence lifts you up above the noise, above the drama, above the back and forth of petty conflicts. Silence says, I refuse to fight on the enemy's terms. I'm letting God fight this one. And when you let God fight, He fights differently than you ever could. He doesn't just settle the situation. He sets things right in a way that reveals His justice and His glory. Your silence gives Him room to handle it His way. Think of Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, forgotten in prison. At every turn he had reason to shout, to defend, to argue, to complain. But he chose silence. He trusted God's hand even when he couldn't understand the plan. And in the end, that silence positioned him for promotion, taking him from the pit to the palace. His silence was not a loss. It was the pathway to destiny. We need to learn from that. Every time you choose silence instead of self-defense, you are practicing trust. Every time you choose not to clap back, you are placing the burden in God's hands. Every time you resist the urge to explain yourself to those who are committed to misunderstanding you, you are living out faith that says, God will vindicate me better than I ever could. That doesn't mean you never speak up for truth. It doesn't mean you allow injustice to roll unchecked. But it does mean you discern when your words are required and when your silence speaks louder. Silence is not about ignoring wrongs. It's about knowing the difference between battles that are yours to fight and battles that belong to the Lord. Silence also strengthens your spirit. It keeps you from wasting emotional energy on arguments that won't change anything. It gives you room to hear God's voice above the chaos. It allows you to focus on His promises instead of other people's opinions. When you learn to be silent in unnecessary battles, you preserve your strength for the fights that truly matter. The fight of faith, the fight for righteousness, the fight to stand strong in a world that wants to pull you away from God. Silence is not weakness. It's strategy. It's God's way of saying, don't waste your weapons on the wrong war. Save them for the battles I've called you to fight. So the next time you feel the urge to defend yourself, the next time you're tempted to prove your worth, the next time your critics demand an answer, remember this: your silence may be the most powerful sermon you'll ever preach. Your silence may be the loudest statement of trust you'll ever make. Your silence may be the very thing that gives God space to fight on your behalf. And when He fights, you don't just win the battle. You walk in the victory He has already secured. There is something extraordinary about looking at the life of Jesus and realizing that even in His silence, He was teaching us the greatest lessons about trust, surrender, and victory. When He stood before His accusers, there was every reason in human logic for Him to defend Himself. The false charges were flying, the lies were spreading, the hatred was building. He could have dismantled every argument with a single sentence, silenced every critic with undeniable truth, and shut down every accusation with the authority that belonged to Him as the Son of God. Yet He didn't. He stood silent. That silence was not weakness. It was power under control. It was trust so deep that it didn't need words. It was surrender so complete that it didn't need argument. His silence was not because He didn't have the truth, but because He was the truth, and the truth doesn't have to prove itself to a lie. That picture of Jesus is one we often overlook because our instinct is always to respond, to defend, to explain, to react. But Jesus shows us that silence in the hands of the faithful is stronger than words in the mouth of the fearful. He stayed silent not because He couldn't speak, but because He chose to let His Father's plan speak louder than anything else. He understood that God's purpose was unfolding even in the injustice, even in the betrayal, even in the lies. And that should encourage us because it means our silence in the face of unfairness is not wasted. When we trust God enough to be quiet, we are placing our situation into the hands of the one who knows how to bring justice far better than we ever could. Look at how his silence protected him from being pulled into a battle he didn't need to fight. The high priests and rulers wanted him to argue on their terms, to get caught up in a war of words that would distract from the cross. But Jesus wasn't going to let them set the agenda. His silence was focus. His silence was refusal to give energy to something beneath his mission. That is what silence can do in your life as well. It keeps you from wasting time and energy on battles that aren't aligned with your calling. It keeps you from being dragged down into conversations that don't build you up. It keeps you focused on the higher purpose God has called you to fulfill. Silence is not retreat, it's restraint. It's knowing that just because you can say something doesn't mean you should. There are times when you will be falsely accused, misunderstood, or judged unfairly. People will misrepresent your actions or your intentions, and your natural reaction will be to fight back, to clear your name, to set the record straight. But remember, if Jesus could stand in silence in the face of lies far greater than anything we will ever endure, then surely we can trust God enough to do the same. Silence in those moments doesn't mean you agree with the falsehood. It doesn't mean you're giving in. It means you are resting in the truth that your Father knows the full story, and His timing will bring it to light. Silence also has a way of silencing the enemy without you having to say a word. When people expect you to lash out, to fight back, to retaliate, and instead you remain calm, that silence unsettles them. It demonstrates that you are anchored in something deeper than emotions. It shows that your confidence is not built on defending yourself, but on the God who defends you. That silence speaks volumes. It preaches louder than a sermon. It communicates to the world that your security is not in what people think, but in who God is. And let's not miss this: Jesus' silence was part of the pathway to our salvation. If he had defended himself, if he had argued his way out, if he had called down angels to fight for him, the cross would never have happened. And without the cross, there would be no redemption. His silence was sacrificial. His silence was purposeful. His silence made way for the greatest victory the world has ever seen: the victory over sin and death. What looked like defeat to the crowd was actually divine triumph, because silence had opened the door for God's plan to be fulfilled. The same is true for us. Sometimes our silence feels like we're losing. It feels like we're letting others win. But God may be using that silence to set up a greater victory. That silence may be the very thing that keeps you in position for His blessing. That silence may be protecting you from battles that would have drained you. That silence may be preparing the stage for His glory to be revealed in a way that no amount of words could ever accomplish. So when you feel pressed to respond, when you feel pushed to defend, when you feel provoked to speak, take a lesson from Jesus. You don't have to give every situation your voice. You don't have to give every accuser your energy. You don't have to fight every battle in your own strength. Sometimes the holiest, strongest, most faith-filled response is silence. Silence that trusts God's plan. Silence that waits on His timing. Silence that believes He is working even when you cannot see it. Silence that says, "Lord, I don't need to handle this," because you already have. There is something about silence that shields you in ways you don't always see in the moment. When emotions run high, when anger rises, when fear creeps in, the tongue is often the first to betray us. Words spoken in haste, words released in frustration, words born out of hurt can cut deeper than any weapon, and once they're spoken, they cannot be taken back. Silence, on the other hand, acts as a guard. It stands at the door of your lips and says, "Not everything that passes through your mind should pass through your mouth." It protects you from turning a temporary feeling into a permanent wound. That's why silence is not just the absence of speech. It is the presence of wisdom. It is the discipline that keeps you from damaging relationships, destroying opportunities, or derailing your destiny because of reckless words. When you are silent, you give space for God to calm your spirit. Anger has a way of clouding judgment. Fear has a way of exaggerating the problem. And disappointment has a way of twisting perception. But when you choose to be silent instead of reacting, you allow time for God's peace to rise up in you before you act. Silence is like taking your emotions to the cross before you put them into the world. It is surrendering your immediate impulse to the Spirit's gentle leading. Many of us know the regret of speaking too quickly, of firing back before we thought it through, of trying to win an argument but losing peace in the process. Silence protects you from those regrets by forcing you to pause, reflect, and invite God into the moment before you make a move. Think about how many relationships have been ruined not because the conflict was too great, but because the words spoken in that conflict were too sharp. Think about how many careers have been jeopardized because someone couldn't hold their tongue in a moment of frustration. Think about how many opportunities have slipped away because silence was traded for rash speech. The Bible tells us that life and death are in the power of the tongue, and silence is one of the ways God teaches us to guard that power. It's not always about saying the right thing. Sometimes it's about not saying anything until God gives you the right words. Silence also creates space for wisdom to take root. When you are quiet, you can listen more clearly, not just to others, but to God. His voice is often drowned out by the noise of our constant talking. We are so quick to fill the air with our opinions, our explanations, our defenses, that we leave little room for him to speak. But silence opens the channel for his spirit to whisper truth, for his word to rise up in your heart, for his direction to settle in your mind. Many of the greatest breakthroughs come not in the noise but in the stillness. When you have quieted your own voice long enough to hear his, silence is not wasted time. It is invested time. It is a holy pause that allows divine wisdom to meet human weakness. And silence doesn't just protect you from saying the wrong thing. It positions you to say the right thing at the right time. When you hold back your words and let God work in your heart first, what comes out later is more thoughtful, more gracious, more impactful. A word spoken in season has power, but a word spoken out of season can cause harm. Silence allows you to wait for the season of your words. It lets you measure your response, align it with God's truth, and release it with purpose instead of impulse. In this way, silence is not weakness, it's strength. It takes more strength to hold back than it does to lash out. It takes more courage to stay quiet than to strike back. Silence is the mark of someone who trusts God enough to believe that every word doesn't need to be spoken and every response doesn't need to be given. Jesus taught us this in his own life. There were times he spoke boldly, declaring truth that shook nations. But there were also times he stayed silent, and his silence was just as powerful as his words. When the woman caught in adultery was thrown before him, the accusers demanded a response. But before he said anything, he bent down and wrote in the sand. That silence shifted the atmosphere. That pause gave space for conviction to work in the hearts of the accusers. Then, when he finally spoke, his words carried weight. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. If he had spoken too quickly, they may have resisted him. But because he allowed silence to set the stage, his words cut straight to the heart. That is the wisdom silence gives you. The ability to let God set the stage so your words carry his weight instead of just your emotion. Silence also becomes a shield against the schemes of the enemy. The devil thrives on chaos, on stirring up strife, on pushing you to react in ways that don't reflect the character of Christ. But when you refuse to give him the satisfaction of your outburst, when you remain silent and let God steady you, you frustrate his plans. Your silence becomes warfare. It declares that you will not be manipulated by pressure, provoked by lies, or driven by fear. You will stand still, stay silent, and trust your defender. So every time you choose silence over a reckless word, you are not just avoiding a mistake. You are walking in wisdom. Every time you hold your peace instead of letting your emotions run wild, you are demonstrating faith. Every time you give God the space to calm you before you respond, you are protecting yourself, your relationships, and your destiny. Silence is not empty. It is full of God's presence, God's wisdom, and God's power. When you think about silence, it can be easy to mistake it for inactivity. People often believe that if they aren't speaking, if they aren't reacting, if they aren't moving, then nothing is happening. But with God, silence is never wasted space. Silence is the soil where trust grows, and trust always leads to action. Not impulsive action, but faithful action. Silence doesn't mean you sit back and do nothing. Silence means you stop striving in your own strength so you can lean fully on God's strength. It means you exchange the noise of fear for the sound of prayer, the chatter of worry for the melody of worship, and the chaos of self-effort for the calm of divine obedience. Silence is not idleness, it is alignment. It positions your heart so that when you move in step with God. Think about it this way. Silence gives your faith room to breathe. When you stop filling the air with anxious words, you make space for your spirit to rise up in expectation. Silence allows you to hear God's whisper when the world is screaming. And while you are silent, you are not empty. You are full of worship, full of prayer, full of hope, full of trust. That trust then leads you to act, but your actions are no longer fueled by desperation. They are fueled by direction. There is a big difference between movement born out of panic and movement born out of God's guidance. Silence helps you tell the difference. Israel experienced this in the wilderness. They often wanted to run ahead to complain, to push God into working on their schedule. But when God told them to be still, it was not an invitation to laziness. It was a command to wait for His instruction. And once His direction came, they were to move forward in faith. Their silence was a setup for their obedience. The walls of Jericho didn't fall because they shouted randomly. They fell because Israel was silent for 6 days and then shouted when God told them to shout. Their silence was preparation. It was trust. It was discipline. And when the time came, their obedience carried the power of God. Silence led to action, and that action led to victory. This is the same truth for us. Your silence is not meant to paralyze you. It's meant to prepare you. While you are quiet before God, He is strengthening your faith. While you are waiting, He is arranging circumstances. While you are listening, He is aligning your steps. Then, when the time comes for you to move, you move with confidence because you know it's not just your decision, it's God's direction. That's the difference between striving in your own power and walking in His. Silence teaches you the rhythm of heaven, so you're not dancing to the tune of fear, but to the melody of faith. And silence doesn't mean you don't participate in your miracle. It means you participate the right way. You pray while you wait. You worship while you watch. You give thanks while you anticipate. You keep serving, you keep loving, you keep obeying God's word, but you don't try to force outcomes that belong to Him. You let your obedience be the echo of your silence. That obedience may look small, like a step of kindness, a prayer of faith, or an act of surrender, but those small steps carry eternal weight when they are rooted in trust. Silence creates the foundation that makes your obedience strong. We see this even in the life of Jesus. There were times when He was silent before His enemies, but He was never inactive before His Father. His silence before people was paired with His prayers before heaven. He would withdraw to quiet places, not to do nothing, but to seek the Father's will. And out of those silent moments came powerful ministry, healing the sick, calming storms, raising the dead. His silence wasn't idleness, it was intimacy. And from that intimacy came impact. That's the pattern we are called to follow. Be silent before the world so you don't waste energy on noise, but be active before God so you gain strength to carry out His assignment. Silence also becomes a declaration of faith to those around you. People expect you to panic, to fight back, to lose control, but when you stay calm and steady in silence, they see something different. They see a faith that cannot be shaken by circumstance. They see a trust that is anchored beyond the storm. Your silence becomes a witness. It says, I don't have to force the outcome, because my God has already written the ending. That kind of silence speaks volumes without you ever opening your mouth. And here's the beauty: silence prepares you for God's sudden moves. Often, His breakthroughs come not when you're striving, but when you're still. You can't force open the sea, but you can stand still and watch it part. You can't bring down the walls, but you can march quietly until God says shout. You can't make the prison doors swing open, but you can sing hymns at midnight and let God shake the foundation. Silence is never wasted. It is the holy pause before the power of God is revealed. So never confuse silence with inactivity. You are not doing nothing when you choose to be silent in faith. You are surrendering. You are preparing. You are aligning. Your silence is your statement of trust. Your obedience is your response of faith. And together they create the stage for God to work in ways far greater than you could ever imagine. When you are silent, you are giving God the pen to keep writing your story. And when you obey, you are living out the chapter He has already prepared. That's not inactivity. That's partnership with heaven. There comes a time when silence isn't about the immediate problem in front of you, but about the bigger picture of what God is doing through it. Silence is not just about surviving the storm. It's about preparing for the testimony that will come when the storm passes. When you are silent, you are not only trusting God to work in the now, you are trusting Him to craft a story out of your life that will speak long after the moment has ended. Silence is a seed, and like every seed, it looks hidden, buried, and forgotten. But given time, it grows into something visible, powerful, and fruitful. Your silence today is shaping your testimony for tomorrow. Think about Joseph. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and forgotten in a prison cell. Nowhere in that journey do we see Joseph lashing out in constant defense of himself. He didn't spend his energy shouting at his brothers or trying to convince Potiphar's wife of the truth. He didn't waste his breath complaining in the dungeon. He trusted God in silence. He did the little things right. He served faithfully where he was placed. He kept his integrity. And years later, his story was not one of defeat, but one of deliverance. His silence became the soil where God grew a testimony that fed nations. The very brothers who betrayed him came back to bow before him, and Joseph could say with confidence, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." That is the power of silence. It allows God to turn your story into a testimony that cannot be denied. Sometimes God calls you to silence not only for your peace, but for the sake of others who will one day hear what he has done in your life. Your silence today is storing up hope for someone tomorrow. When you resist the urge to fight with your own hands and instead trust the hand of God, you are allowing him to create a story that will speak louder than anything you could ever argue. Your silence becomes your sermon. Your patience becomes your pulpit. Your endurance becomes your evidence. People may not listen to your words, but they will not be able to ignore your life. Look at Daniel. When the decree was signed that no one could pray to any god but the king, Daniel didn't start a loud protest in the streets. He didn't try to defend himself in the king's court. He went quietly to his room, opened his window toward Jerusalem, and prayed to his God just as he had always done. His silence was not weakness, it was faith. His consistency in prayer became his strength. And when he was thrown into the lion's den, it wasn't his voice that saved him. It was the God who heard his silent prayers. When morning came, Daniel walked out alive, and the king himself declared the power of Daniel's God. His silence had become a testimony that turned a nation's heart. That's what silence does. It allows God to author the narrative. Because when you fight for yourself, you may win or lose depending on your strength. But when you are silent and let God fight, you can be certain the victory will belong to him. And that victory will always point others to his glory. Your silence becomes the canvas on which God paints his power. And when he is finished, your life becomes the evidence of his faithfulness, a testimony that others can look at and say, if God did it for them, he can do it for me. Even in your own life, you can look back and see how some of your greatest testimonies didn't come when you fought the hardest in your own power, but when you held your peace and let God do the heavy lifting. You prayed, you waited, you stayed faithful, and when God showed up, it was undeniable. That's why silence is so powerful. It creates space for undeniable testimonies. When people ask, how did that happen? You can't say it was your cleverness, your strength, or your strategy. You can only say it was God. And that declaration becomes a testimony that no one can take away from you. Silence also keeps your testimony pure. When you resist the urge to lash out, defend yourself, or manipulate outcomes, you keep yourself from muddying the story. You won't have to look back and wonder if it was God or if it was your schemes that brought you through. Silence ensures that the glory belongs to him alone. It's his hand that opens the door, his power that delivers, his grace that sustains. And when you tell your story, people won't see you as the hero, they'll see him as the savior. That's the kind of testimony that changes lives. And here's the beautiful part. Silence doesn't just shape your testimony, it strengthens your faith while you wait for it. Every time you hold your tongue instead of complaining, every time you resist panic and choose prayer, every time you wait instead of rushing ahead, you are building spiritual muscle. You are preparing yourself not just for the miracle, but for the weight of the testimony that comes with it. Because when God does what only he can do, your story won't just bless you, it will bless countless others. Your silence is not just about you. It's about the generations who will be encouraged by what God does through you. So when you are tempted to break your silence with fear, remember the testimony God is writing. When you feel like defending yourself, remember the story God is shaping. When you want to fight in your own strength, remember the witness he is preparing. Silence today may feel like surrender, but tomorrow it will sound like victory. And when the time comes to speak, you won't be speaking from a place of worry. You'll be speaking from a place of testimony. You'll be able to say, I was silent, I trusted him, and he came through. That testimony will echo louder and longer than any words you could have spoken in the heat of the moment. Life has a way of pressing us into corners where it feels like the only option is to cry out, to defend ourselves, or to take matters into our own hands. We want to fix it, control it, make something happen just to ease the weight of the unknown. But the truth we must hold on to is that silence before God is not weakness, it is strength. It is not the absence of action, but the presence of trust. It is choosing to believe that the one who parted the Red Sea, who shut the mouths of lions, who walked into fiery furnaces, and who raised Jesus from the dead is the same one standing with you in your struggle. When you are silent, you are not defeated. You are declaring that your victory comes from the Lord. We've seen this pattern again and again. God calls his people into silence, not to embarrass them, but to elevate them. He doesn't say, be still, because he wants you to do nothing. He says, be still, because he is already doing something you cannot yet see. Your silence is the stage on which his glory will be revealed. Think about Moses standing before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army pressing in behind. The people were panicking, crying out, ready to blame Moses for their impending destruction. But Moses spoke with the confidence of heaven. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. In their silence, God stretched out his hand and made a way where there was no way. That same God is still working today. Silence does not mean you bury your feelings or ignore your reality. It means you place those feelings and realities in the hands of the one who can handle them better than you can. It means you stop rehearsing your fears and start rehearsing his faithfulness. It means that instead of wasting your words on complaints, you turn them into prayers of surrender. And in that surrender, you find peace. Peace that does not depend on circumstances. Peace that flows like a river even when the storm is raging. That kind of peace comes only when you've made the decision to stop fighting battles that don't belong to you and let God fight on your behalf. There will be times when silence feels uncomfortable, when it feels like inactivity, when it feels like you're falling behind. But silence is never wasted when it is rooted in trust. Silence is preparation. It is God pulling you aside, training your faith, strengthening your resolve, and positioning you for a victory that will not only bless you, but bless everyone connected to you. You may not see the breakthrough today, but that doesn't mean God is not working. Seeds are always silent before they sprout. The soil doesn't shake, the ground doesn't shout, but beneath the surface life is growing. Your silence is the soil where God is planting miracles that will break forth in due season. And silence does something else. It keeps you from sabotaging your own testimony. How many times have we spoken too soon, acted too fast, or tried to force something in our own strength only to make the situation worse? Silence saves you from yourself. It protects you from letting your emotions outrun your faith. It anchors you in the truth that God's ways are higher than yours and his timing is better than yours. It teaches you patience. It builds your character. And it reminds you that your story is not about proving yourself right, but about proving God faithful. When you are silent, you are allowing the author of your life to finish the chapter without your edits. What emerges from that kind of trust is a testimony that cannot be denied. Joseph's silence in the pit and the prison prepared him for the palace. Daniel's silence in the lion's den turned a king's decree into a declaration of God's power. Jesus' silence on the cross became the loudest shout of victory the world has ever known. Their silence was not the end. It was the doorway to a greater story. And in the same way, your silence will not be wasted. The God who heard their cries in the quiet will hear yours too. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, which means your silence will be transformed into a testimony that declares his glory. So when the world pressures you to panic, when circumstances tempt you to lash out, when the enemy whispers that your silence means defeat, remember the truth. Silence is not surrender to your problem. It is surrender to your provider. Silence is not giving up. It is giving over. It is handing the reins to the one who has never lost a battle. It is standing still long enough for him to show you that his power is greater than any enemy, his wisdom is higher than any strategy, and his love is deeper than any fear. At the end of the day, silence is not about doing less. It's about trusting more. It's about resting in the truth that God is helping you in every situation, not just some. He is present in the details you overlook, active in the battles you can't see, and faithful in the promises you can't yet hold. You may not always hear him, but you can trust that he is working. And when the time is right, your silence will give way to shouts of praise. Your waiting will turn into walking in victory, and your story will become a testimony that points everyone around you to the goodness of God. So hold your peace. Stay steady in your trust. Let your silence speak louder than your fear. And remember this, God is not asking you to be silent because he is absent. He is asking you to be silent because he is present. He is with you, He is for you, and He is already making a way. Your silence is your declaration that you believe Him, and your testimony will be the evidence that He never fails.